Right. I want to move on to real estate development, which, as you know, is at times controversial, but also an important part of our growth. What's your view of the city's development review process? And does it need to be streamlined? And if so, what does that mean?
Well, I do think that we've heard from a lot of developers that the review process is too onerous and in many ways too costly. Developers have to pay a price with the time that they're spending and the amount of sort of back and forth. We need to make sure that by expediting the process that we are talking to residents and creating plans that are clear, that are supported by neighborhoods, so that developers can come in with a sense of clarity for what's going to be supported, and that the city's bureaucracy, if you would, doesn't get in the way and make it more expensive. Boston's already an expensive city, so I've already proposed in my housing plan two things. One is that we need to create more housing in the city of Boston. We haven't kept pace with the population. I remember sitting in the mayor's office talking about our 69,000 unit goal and wondering whether the population growth would continue. Well, actually, the population growth outpaced our projections. So we need to build more, and then we need to build more affordably. And so in my housing plan, I've called for a streamlined permitting process for any development that includes affordable housing. And I think as a city, we shouldn't be in the way, and we shouldn't be making it more costly for developers to build.
It absolutely does. We talk about the number one issue right now in the city of Boston, and I've heard this not only from various surveys that have been done, particularly of voters and employers, is housing affordability and how expensive it is to live in the city of Boston. Every one of us has a role to play in changing that. What I've also heard is, while we can, of course, push the city of Boston to be creative, I started the vacant lot initiative, activating city-owned vacant lots for housing purposes and pushing for more streams of revenue to create more affordable housing. I've also heard at the same time, it takes too long to build in the city of Boston. A recent builder told me it's easier to build affordable housing in New York City than it is in the city of Boston, which is absolutely ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And so streamlining processes means for me, looking at, for example, the Article 80 process and removing affordable housing projects out of that process as a way to speed up the development of affordable housing without, of course, taking out community voice, but speeding it up in one way to streamline process and allow housing to be built quicker. So it's less time consuming and less expensive, which of course is good for everybody. Also looking at ISD. We often talk about the BPDA and certain and the zoning board, but ISD and other departments in the city play a major role. Many of these agencies are understaffed. Many of these agencies don't have staff that have the breadth of expertise that they would need with respect to doing projects of a certain magnitude. The BPDA, for example, doesn't have anyone on the team who has a deep understanding of financing and how difficult it is to finance affordable housing projects. So diversifying our staff, expanding our staff to have more human capital while cutting the red tape and bureaucracy, I think will absolutely allow us to build more affordable housing quicker in the city of Boston, save costs, and address this crisis.
Well, certainly there's some general agreement that the process needs to be streamlined, that there has to be greater transparency and more opportunity to engage in that process in a very sort of public and transparent way. And those are, I think, for elected officials and politicians and those running for office, those are all, wonderful key phrases or hashtags to use when discussing the work that needs to happen in order to continue to grow our city, but grow it in a smart and thoughtful way. For me, when we think about the role of developing our city, of planning our city, of growing our city, especially realizing, recognizing the economic opportunity that brings to our city that allows us to do other things like invest in our schools and invest in infrastructure, improve the conditions of our roads and our transit system, making sure that our cities are safe and remain safe through time. we have to do this work together. But the development process in particular, especially for me, I'm committed to making sure that this city continues to have opportunities to grow, that we do it in a thoughtful and very intentional way, that we are looking at planning separate from development so that we can be smart about the city's growth, but then do the work and continuing to build our city in a way that makes our city more attractive to invest in and to attract talent to, but certainly build the local assets that we have, especially our people, for those new opportunities. So growth is important, making sure that that growth creates opportunities for our city's people. We have to do it together. And, again, back to your opening remarks around partnership and collaboration, we have to do this work together, have to do it in the public space, have to do it in a very smart and intentional way.
Well, we do need to remove barriers and make doing business with the city easier without cutting corners. So it is important that we do our due diligence, but there is an opportunity in my administration. My team is working on some streamlined approaches, whether we're talking about outdoor dining, whether we're talking about real estate development. Again, important to make sure that we do our due diligence. And so that is definitely something that we are working on.
I came into government, as I mentioned, through frustrations dealing with government and on the family side. And one of the most foundational experiences that opened my eyes to how much government details matter was striking out and opening a small business as an entrepreneur and trying to do something that was going to help my family, my neighborhood, the larger community, but facing such red tape, such hoops to jump through, such complicated, and it felt at times arbitrary rules. And so I've come into government really understanding just how much of a barrier it creates when we have complicated processes that plenty of folks can still get through if you have the resources to navigate processes for a long time or hire expertise who can help facilitate that for you. And so if we really want to close the racial wealth gap, if we really want to ensure that we are building wealth locally in our neighborhoods, we have to simplify processes across the board. With development in particular, I've had an eye into this as chair of the City Council's Planning, Development, and Transportation Committee. And what I know is that when our zoning code dates back to a last comprehensive review in 1965, and when the disconnect between what that code says in so many cases and what is feasible economically and what matches our needs in terms of climate resiliency or affordability or transportation access or density, when that disconnect is there and we have to go through a parcel by parcel, case by case negotiation, we are spending such resources in the soft costs of that process, as opposed to being able to keep margins down and build more affordable units or ensure that we are matching what we need with neighborhoods. So what I proposed are changes to this development process that would get us to a predictable, clear, and consistent code. We need to have an understanding that when someone goes in and enters that process, there's a clear, predictable outcome. And it's not just putting you into a gauntlet for neighbors and for developers, not knowing what might emerge on the other side and building up so much cost in the meantime that should be going to delivering the types of changes and closing the gaps that we need in Boston.
Right. Sticking to development, the Seaport District has been criticized by many of the candidates. What do you think is wrong with the way the development unfolded in the Seaport? What would you have done differently, or what would you do differently going forward with such an opportunity?
Well, I think there are a number of things that we've learned from the Seaport. First, I'll give the Menino administration some credit for turning around an area that had a bunch of parking lots. And, sort of when they first, I remember, talked about the Innovation District, some people laughed. Talking to Mitch Weiss, he talked about there were a lot of naysayers. But they did turn it around, and maybe they didn't even believe that they were going to be able to turn it around this way and have this kind of development. But what's missing is real investment in transit infrastructure in the Seaport. We see the traffic in and out of the seaport is not conducive to the kind of growth that's already been approved in the seaport. And so, as you asked the question, what we would do differently, master planning would include more transit infrastructure. And then, there's not a lot of participation, not a lot of diversity in the seaport. And that's unfortunate. We, in fact, should be more intentional about centering equity and participation in the growth of any neighborhood. With the new disparity study we have the opportunity, in fact, to set goals on participation in construction, but also set goals on participation of who is going to be operating the different retail spaces in our new buildings, or be able to own the different part of condos or different commercial spaces in our neighborhoods. We need to be more intentional about that as a city, and then not just in planning, but also in providing the capital that's needed for people to participate, the technical assistance, and make sure we're doing the recruitment in a way that people understand what the opportunities are.
First, I'll take a step back. When I grew up in the city, the seaport didn't exist. And Fenway actually didn't look like the way it did now. And frankly, the seaport, we were told not to go down because there was nothing down there. But when you think about, we built a brand new neighborhood in the city of Boston that is probably one of the least diverse, the most expensive to live in, and has a very small percentage of businesses owned and run by women and people of color. That's a problem. And I think it's a problem that is indicative of the larger narrative of the city of Boston that I think we all want to change, right? Boston has a reputation of being the most racist city in the country. Boston, for some, that is not a perception, that is a reality. And I firmly and deeply love the city of Boston and know that we can change that. But it really does require intentionality. I know that there are folks, of course, working extremely hard to ensure that more people of color, more BIPOC entrepreneurs and businesses have access to capital and technical assistance to be able to open up in the seaport. I know that work is ongoing, and I've been pushing to say, let's do it swiftly and quickly. But it really starts with planning. Right now in the city of Boston, we have the 2030 plan started by our previous mayor. There's some good stuff in there, but we need to do a little bit more planning. What does every neighborhood need? Not just in terms of housing, but in terms of business infrastructure, economic development. There are some neighborhoods that don't have access to good parks, good transit. We need to change all that, but we can't change it if we don't have a deep sense of what a community needs. And once we know that, of course, informed by the residents who live there, we then push the city of Boston to build in response. And I think that planning is going to be critically important going forward. But the second tier that I think is important is not just having a sense of what every neighborhood needs, but also this larger overlay that the city of Boston must do. When we talk about climate and resiliency, the neighborhood may say, we want to build close to the water. The city of Boston might have to say, that's not a good idea when you think about flooding and issues of climate going forward. So we always have to sort of keep in mind, how do we make our city more resilient, more inclusive, and more accessible, so that every neighborhood, as they're building and developing their plans, align with this larger vision of creating a more equitable, a more inclusive, accessible, and climate resilient city in the city of Boston.
Yeah, no, the seaport is certainly a fascinating case study, and doing things, again, in the right way and then in the wrong way. And, certainly the challenges around the location of the seaport, thinking about the water and how beautiful the access to the water is, but also proximity to the airport. And I remember, gosh, I think it's 20 plus years ago, attending community meetings around the redevelopment and the rezoning and the planning for the seaport, and realizing because of FAA requirements and restrictions, there's very specific height requirements. So then we moved to fill every parcel to its maximum capacity. And that's why we saw, especially in early planning and early building, super density without sort of unique or authentic or aesthetically pleasing architecture and design. We're seeing that shift now in some of the newer growth and development and building that's happened in the seaport is a little bit more diverse and certainly more aesthetically pleasing. We've got to continue on that path as the seaport continues to get developed, but also making sure that it isn't anywhere USA. And in some parts of the seaport, if, me, born and raised in this city, if I'm in the seaport, especially if I can't see the water, I don't know where I am. And I literally could be anywhere USA. And that to me is very unfortunate. We also need to make sure that we are creating opportunities for the city's people to have experiences in the seaport, that businesses are owned by people that live in the city, that grew up in the city, that ownership of both small businesses and the housing down there is also reflective of the people of Boston. There is unfortunately a great lack of diversity when it comes to the people that live and work and own in the seaport. And we've got to be very intentional about changing that, not just that narrative, but that reality for the seaport. And I think certainly when we work with new industries who want to locate in the seaport, that we're doing that together, and that we're also making sure that residents and tourists and those that spend the day in the city of Boston, if they're coming here to work, have access to the waterfront, and that we're also being thoughtful about the impacts of climate change on both the seaport and what we do there, how it impacts the rest of our city coming inland.
I think, again, that was a lack of intentionality, of being very intentional around inclusion and opportunity and equity. For me, I bring an equity lens to everything that I do. It is in part based on my lived experience, personal and professional. And so I think in all development, not just in the seaport and any neighborhood, we have an opportunity to do things differently. There is a beacon of hope there in the Omni Hotel. And I think that can serve as a model for how we do development all across our city. And it really does need to be intentional in terms of a focus on equity.
We have a city funding source that is largely driven by our tax base, and within that largely driven by commercial development. And there's a push and pull in Boston of we need to ensure that we're continuing to grow in order to fund all of the services that are needed at the city level. And in some ways, the seaport was successful in creating lots of jobs in the trades during that boom, in seeing tax revenues built up to fund city services and other amenities as new properties came online and have been contributing to that tax base. But when you think about who is represented of Boston's community, who feels comfortable in the seaport, whose fortunes and wealth were represented in the growth of that district, we have fallen short in addressing our urgent needs for equity and for connectedness. This is a district where I point out that our housing goals have not been met in terms of wanting to ensure that there is a growing residential component to that neighborhood. We've fallen short of what the planned goals had been. Our transportation goals have not been met in that we've had a little reprieve during the pandemic, but we are headed right back there with traffic in a part of the city that we were proposing a gondola system to be able to fly people out of traffic, because that's how badly it had gotten in terms of the disconnect with available flow and access for public transportation. And it's also an area of the city that is extremely climate vulnerable, and where not too many years ago in the snowmageddon of winter, early 2018, we saw some critical infrastructure, T stations, taken out for 8-9 months at a time because of the flooding, the waters that were pushed from buildings that were armed to deal with those floods, but not the infrastructure. And so we really need district planning, we need neighborhood planning, we need citywide planning. That is the crux of the changes that I hope to present in order to ensure that we are growing in a way that is compatible with our long-term sustainability and resiliency, and with the drive to ensure that Boston is representing the full diversity of our community in how we are growing and benefiting.